Some Terms of Thought in Modern Philosophy. Essay number 2, 50 Years of British Idealism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Some Terms of Thought in Modern Philosophy. 5 essays by George Santayana. Essay number 2, 50 Years of British Idealism. Reflections on the republication of Bradley's Ethical Studies. After 50 years, an old milestone in the path of philosophy, Bradley's Ethical Studies has been set up again as if to mark the distance which English opinion has traversed in the interval. It has passed from insular dogmatism to universal bewilderment, and a chief agent in the change has been Bradley himself, with his scornful and delicate intellect, his wit, his candour, his persistence, and the baffling futility of his conclusions. In this early book we see him coming forth like a young David against every clumsy champion of utilitarianism, hedonism, positivism, or empiricism. And how smooth and polished were the little stones in his sling! How fatally they would have lodged in the forehead of that composite monster if only it had had a forehead. Some of them might even have done murderous execution in Bradley's own camp. For instance, this pebble cast playfully at the metaphysical idol called law. Quote, "It is always wet on half-holidays because of the law of raininess, but sometimes it is not wet because of the supplementary law of sunshine." End quote. Bradley and his friends achieved a notable victory in the academic field. Philosophic authority and influence passed largely into their hands in all English-speaking universities. But it was not exactly from these seats of learning that naturalism and utilitarianism needed to be dislodged like the corresponding radicalisms of our day. These doctrines prevailed rather in certain political and intellectual circles outside, consciously revolutionary and often half-educated, and I am afraid that the braggart Goliaths of today need chastening at least as much as those of 50 years ago. In a country officially Christian, and especially in Oxford, it is natural and fitting that academic authority should belong to orthodox tradition, theological, Platonic, and Aristotelian. Bradley, save for a few learned quotations, strangely ignored this orthodoxy entrenched behind his back. In contrast with it, he was himself a heretic, with first principles devastating every settled belief, and it was really his venerable silent partner at home that his victories superseded, at least in appearance and for a season. David did not slay Goliath, but he dethroned Saul. Saul was indeed already under a cloud, and all in David's heart was not unkindness in that direction. Bradley might almost be called an unbelieving Newman. Time, especially, seems to have brought his suffering and refined spirit into greater sympathy with ancient sanctities. Originally, for instance, venting the hearty Protestant sentiment that only the Christianity of laymen is sound, he had written, quote, "I am happy to say that religion has no English equivalent." End quote. But a later note says, quote, "This is not true except of modern English only, and in any case it won't do, and was wrong and due to ignorance. However secluded the religious life, it may be practical indirectly, if, through the utility of the spiritual body, it can be taken as vicarious." End quote. The "if" here saves the principle that all values must be social, and that the social organism is the sole moral reality. Yet how near this bubble comes to being pricked! We seem clearly to feel that the question is not whether spiritual life subserves animal society, but whether animal society ever is stirred and hallowed into spiritual life. All this, however, in that age of progress was regarded as obsolete. there was no longer to be any spirit except the spirit of the times. True, the ritualist might be striving to revive the latent energies of religious devotion with some dubious help from aestheticism, but against the rising tide of mechanical progress and romantic anarchy, and against the mania for rewriting history, traditional philosophy then seemed helpless and afraid to defend itself. It is only now beginning to recover its intellectual courage. For the moment, speculative radicals saw light in a different quarter. German idealism was nothing if not self-confident. It was relatively new. It was encyclopedic in its display of knowledge, which it could manipulate dialectically with dazzling, if not stable, results. It was Protestant in temper and autonomous in principle, and altogether it seemed a sovereign and providential means of suddenly turning the tables on the threatened naturalism. By developing romantic intuition from within, and packing all knowledge into one picture, the universe might be shown to be, like intuition itself, thoroughly spiritual, personal, and subjective. The fundamental axiom of the new logic was that the only possible reality was consciousness. Quote, "People find," writes Bradley, "a subject and an object correlated in consciousness. To go out of that unity is for us literally to go out of our minds. When mind is made only a part of the whole, there is a question which must be answered. If about any matter we know nothing whatsoever, can we say anything about it? Can we even say that it is? And if it is not in consciousness, how can we know it? And conversely, if we know it, it cannot be not mind." End quote. Bradley challenged his contemporaries to refute this argument, and not being able to do so, many of them felt constrained to accept it, perhaps not without grave misgivings. For was it not always a rooted conviction of the British mind that knowledge brings material power, and that any figments of consciousness, in religion for instance, not bringing material power, are dangerous bewitchments, and not properly knowledge? Yet it is no less characteristic of the British mind to yield occasionally, up to a certain point, to some such enthusiastic fancy, provided that its incompatibility with honest action may be denied or ignored. So in this case, British idealists, in the act of defining knowledge idealistically as the presence to consciousness of its own phenomena, never really ceased to assume transcendent knowledge of a self-existing world, social and psychological, if not material, and they continued scrupulously to readjust their ideas to those dark facts, often more faithfully than the avowed positivists or scientific psychologists. What could ethics properly be to a philosopher who on principle might not trespass beyond the limits of consciousness? Only ethical sentiment. Bradley was satisfied to appeal to the moral consciousness of his day, without seeking to transform it. The most intentionally eloquent passage in his book describes war fever, unifying and carrying away a whole people that was the summit of moral consciousness and of mystic virtue. His aim, even in ethics, was avowedly to describe that which exists, to describe moral experience without proposing a different form for it. A man must be a man of his own time or nothing. To set up to be better than the world was the beginning of immorality, and virtue lay in accepting one's station and its duties. The moralist should fill his mind with a concrete picture of the task and standards of his age and nation, and should graft his own ideals upon that tree. This need not prevent moral consciousness from including a decided esteem for non-political excellences like health, beauty, or intelligence, which are not ordinarily called virtues by modern moralists. Yet they are undeniably good, better, perhaps, than any painful and laborious dutifulness, so that the strictly moral consciousness might run over, and presently lose itself in something higher. Indeed, even health, beauty, and intelligence, which seemed at first so clearly good, might